Okay, so today we've got Tricia Walsh with us. So welcome, Tricia, to Aotearoa Actual.
Kia
So you're a mother of four. You're a grandmother of 13 mokos. You're also a registered social worker. And recently you were a spokesperson at the Maori Justice Hui. I have to admit, I'm one of your biggest fans after I saw that amazing speech that you did at the Justice Hui. So I'll just get you to tell us a bit about you and a bit of background on what you do.
So I'm quite active in most communities across New Zealand in the family violence, sexual violence space. What I do is I've taken my not so great past, colourful past, and I've used those experiences to first to impact in spaces where decisions are made about us, without us, and also using lived experience as a way of navigating spaces with whānau who are going through those same experiences. But I bring with that the knowing that I already know, I know what some of the things that they could be going through, how they're feeling, and I'm able to form quite respectful relationships with whānau because of that. I've been in Australia a few times, speaking at conferences over there, again around my lived experience, and that's in the criminal justice space with women and their experiences of incarceration over in Brisbane, and we've been around Western Australia with the family violence kaupapa. So I think so for me it's about taking that not so great past and turning it on its head and using that now as a way to make change for whānau that are still stuck there.
So are you able to tell us, you had a rough upbringing. Are you able to tell us where you were raised and kind of some details around your upbringing and what happened to you during that? So you were raised in the 70s and whereabouts, yeah?
So I was born in 1966, a very good year. And I was born here in Gisborne, Te Tairāwhiti. Most of my childhood was not far from here. It was in Scott Street, down by the airport. And then I spent from 12 till I was probably 17 in Kaiti. My life, as far back as I can remember it, it's alcohol and violence were the centre of my parents' world. So alcohol and violence actually shaped the behaviours within our home, how my mother and dad parented us or failed to parent us. And because of those I guess I'll say failings, I in particular was exposed to a lot of violence from my mum and sexual abuse from my dad and sexual abuse from a lot of different, I guess, family members and if we go back to parties, a lot of different people that were that came to our house to party, and our house was a party house. Every weekend there was a raging party. Like, once we're warriors, actually, we were raised like that.
So there'll be these parties, right? And there's crates of beer coming in, and there's strange people walking around the house, and you're this young child, and you're kind of in this situation where you're kind of confused, and there's all these people, and it's really noisy, and you're kind of living this situation.
Absolutely, and they weren't always strangers. Most of the time it was whānau. And like mum and dad would go off to the pub first, happily. So my big brother was normally left to care for us, and he's 6 years older than me. So when I would have been 3, he would have been 9, and it was normal back then for the tuakana to care for you. So my brother did a lot of caring for me, and then my younger brother was 15 months younger than me. But even at 3 years of age, my dad had already been sexually abusing me before 3. So my world was pretty shattered anyway. There was no trust in my world anyway, because my dad was sexually abusing me, and I can remember at 4 my mother stomping my head in, kicking my body in, and till she had no breath, and then crawling off down a passageway to find some sort of comfort under my bed. So even without the parties, our upbringing was brutal.
So, your father was abusing you, and it must have been undescribable. What was your coping mechanism?
I think as a child I learnt to leave my body. During while he was sexually abusing me, I can remember like freezing, fear. It can, if you experience, in my experience, when I was terrified, which I spent most of my life in a state of terror, so I was terrified. I learnt to in freezing, I could leave my body and I could be up there watching what was happening to me, but not actually experiencing the pain and the trauma of it. And that was, probably around 3. I remember not being present in my body.
I've actually heard about this. This is called an out-of-body experience. So they actually have reports of people who were on the surgery table, near-death experience, and they leave their body. They can look back down in the surgery room and they can see themselves, and then something happens and they get revived, and then they end up back in their body. So I've also heard about that there was a prisoner in Alcatraz prison, and they used to lock him down in one of the cells, and he used to have one of these out-of-body experiences, and he could go off to San Francisco, and then he'll come back, and the guards would let him out of solitary, and he'll be able to tell them about baseball games and stuff. So I imagine that for you, you're going through this trauma, and one of the ways to preserve your mind and body and soul is for your soul to sort of elevate away from your body, get out of it, and then the trauma happens, and then you return. Do you think that it's an out of body experience that you were having to cope with the trauma?
Yeah, well, look, you know, I know that I wasn't present, in whether that, you know, in my wairua was still in the room, because, you know, I know that as Maori we astral travel, but I just found that I was able, and I think that's amazing that our bodies are so amazing that for me to survive all of that stuff, I was able to leave my body. But, you know, the sad thing is, you still, when you come back, you still are left to deal with the emotions and the, you know, that sense of the shame, the dirtiness, you know, the blaming yourself, all of those things that as a child, any child, no matter, let alone being a 3, 4, you know, those years when, you know, what we're doing is we're shaping our belief and our self-worth by the experiences and the behaviours of those around us. And, you know, my parents taught me that I was worthless. You know, my family taught me that I was worthless. And, you know, I think because there was so many different abusers in my life, I believe that the way that my mum, the way how she was violent towards me, and she didn't show much affection towards me, that other whānau members saw that, and I believe that's how pedophiles and child abusers pick their targets. They look for the most unloved one, and if that's what they were looking for, then they found that in me, because there was nobody around me growing up who took the time to show me love, other than that dysfunctional, abusive love.
Was your mother ever a victim of your father's abuse?
So my mum was, I was 12 when my mum and dad finally split up because he set the house on fire while me and my brother were in bed, in one of his drunkard stupors he used to get into. But so till I was around, and then they got back together after I was 12, but by then my father was extremely violent to my mum up until the age of 12. Then when he got out of, he was sent away for setting the house on fire, my mother became the abuser and she beat him. But growing up, he would stab her. You know, I'd hear her crying in the middle of the night, and, you know, as I said, I lived my life in a state of terror, so it was really, really hard to leave my bed to go to look and see what was happening with my mother, because I was so terrified. But I would hear her wailing and calling out, and just in the sound she used to make, I knew she needed somebody to help her. And, you know, I'd walk from my room to the kitchen or somewhere, and she'd be lying on the floor, you know, with no clothes on. Wouldn't have clothes on, and, you know, she'd have forks sticking out of her head, and her breasts and her side, and it was like he would just be stabbing at her, and she'd just be sitting there, and and as a 6 or 7 year old, that helplessness of not being able to actually help her, other than saying, I can remember saying to my dad, please Dad, stop, and for that minute he sort of noticed that I was in the room, but he just told me to go to bed. And my mum would be asking me to ring up to an uncle or someone, usually my auntie's husband, and and I'd be too scared to do that, too scared of what my father might do to me if he found out I did that, and then you carry the I don't know, intense guilt of not being able to make it stop, not being able to find someone to come and help my mother. Just a whole lot of emotions and thoughts that children shouldn't have to be dealing with.
So you're 6 years old. You go into the kitchen. Your mother's there lying naked, beaten, with blood pouring out of her. She's got a fork sticking out of her head. And you're 6 years old, and you're witnessing a level of violence that is just unbelievable. And what's going through your mind as that 16-year-old kid? You're just horrified and scared and terrified.
It's the terror. It's just living in a constant state of terror, because even when they're not fighting, you're waiting for it. You're waiting for the violence. You even when you're on a Sunday drive and you stop and you get an ice cream, you're waiting, expecting, knowing that at any moment that switch could flip, and that laughing, much like those Once Were Warriors parties, it's all singing and laughter, and the spoons and the and you sort of come alive in those moments, but in the back of your mind that very shortly that laughter is going to turn to swearing and screaming, and so it's that it was the terror, and knowing, I guess, that if my mum ran away, if she did get away from there, that then I'd be left there with my father. So there was always two sides of the fear. It was the fear of that not being able to help my mother, but knowing that I couldn't help myself either.
So you really loved your mother, and then the father gets taken away when he tried to burn down the house, and so was there some? Were you feeling safe after he got taken out of your life? Like, did things improve for you?
No, because like I think I already said, my dad was only one of many abusers in my life. Many. I'm talking around 50 different.
Could you turn to your mother?
No, because my mother was beating me so badly. I learnt really young that adults weren't safe, that the world wasn't safe. I mean, as a 6-year-old, in one of Mum's, in one of those parties, the neighbour was at our house, and I learnt. But at 6, I was so I'll call it bed smart, because I knew when the door to the sitting room or my bedroom door was opening from the sound of the music. So I could tell when somebody was leaving the party space, and I knew then that I was at risk because of the difference in the sound of the music. And I would then brace myself by pulling the blanket up really tight up around my chin and stiffening my body and holding my breath, and just depending on whether I heard the creaking of the floorboards, the turning of the handle of the door, then I could either relax, or then I would just wait to be able to leave that for my out of body experience to happen. And
If you could just explain the incident where there was a party one night and someone else got involved and you were in bed.
yeah, so when I was 6, I already talked about the being able to leave my body, but I'd also learned about how I could tell whether people were getting closer in my space, and it was around being able. I would hear the sitting room door opening or closing, which meant somebody was leaving the party and they were either going to go to the toilets, or the squeaking of floors, the turning of the bedroom door handle, those kind of things. So on this particular night, my mum and dad, they were having another party, and the neighbour, he lived right next door to us. He was in the sitting room with mum and dad, and I heard the music go loud, so I knew that someone had left the sitting room. And then I heard the turning of the bedroom door handle, so again I knew that somebody was entering the room. And I heard at that time I would brace myself, I would stiffen up my body, I would pull the cover up and shut my eyes. Because I didn't, when there were parties, I didn't sleep. Even as a little girl, I knew that I was unsafe, so I would stay up. And so I was awake, and I would shut my eyes, because I didn't want to see who the abuser was. I didn't want them to look into my eyes and see my soul and see my fear. I didn't want to be part of what was happening. So I would shut my eyes, and this night I heard the 2 doors, I heard the music get loud, I heard the squeaking of the floorboards, and then I felt the drunkard breath on my face, the whiskers scratching against my cheek, and I left my body, and I just sat up there above, looking down, watching the neighbour touching me, doing things to a 6-year-old child that you just shouldn't do. But he was doing it, and and then kissing me and whispering things in my ear, and and then saying to me not to tell anybody, that was our secret, and then walking off, and and then as a 6-year-old, being back in my body and just turning on my side, and I still remember a little tear rolling, this from this eye into that ear, but a tear coming across my nose. But while this was happening, this is the my brother was asleep beside me, you know, and we were in the same bed. And my brother, so I was 6, he would have been 12. And, you know, and then the neighbour walking out, closing the door. I heard the toilet go, flush, and then he walked back into the party. And then, like I said, my dad must have recognised something in the way he behaved, because my dad was known in the community and the corrections and the justice as a predator, as a sexual predator. That was the label my father had been given. And so he came into the bedroom and he walked over to me, and I didn't know whether it was someone else coming to have their way with me. So I braced myself the same way I did when the neighbour came in. I held my breath and stiffened my body and waited with my eyes shut. And my dad, I just heard him say, you know, did the such and such come into the room? And I just, without words, I just shook my head and I didn't open my eyes. And then he goes rushing out, and then there's a big fight and the smashing of beer bottles and screaming and swearing, and then people leaving. And I didn't want that attention. I mean, I was only 6, but I knew I didn't want anybody beaten up. So I felt guilty because of that. And then instantly, you know, and then my mother comes in and she just drags me out of the bed. And she asked me why I didn't wake my brother up. And as a 6-year-old, I didn't have the words to explain why. I didn't have the words to be able to tell my mum, oh, Mum, you know what, I've learnt this really cool thing. You know, that for the last 4.5 years while I've been getting sexually abused by my father and my uncles and your uncles and everyone else, that I've learnt to leave my body. And you know, I didn't have the words to tell my mother that. So I just sat there wordless, voiceless. And so she said to me, I must have wanted it. And she flipped me on the floor and she stomped on me. And I learnt right there and then, as a 6-year-old girl, that I would never tell anybody else anything, because the consequences of being hurt the way that I had been hurt by the neighbour and, you know, the men that were hurting me that way, they weren't as bad as having your mother beat you the way that my mother used to beat me. And I think really for me after that, my mother found it really hard to show me any love and affection. I think in her eyes I became dirty, and and I can't ever remember her holding me or loving me after that moment. Yeah.
So you're going through levels of abuse, and you obviously got scars physically on your body.
Yep.
People must be able to see this. You're going to school. Surely, are there third parties like teachers, social workers, anyone who's picking up that there's this young girl who's just things are being done to her? Is anyone picking up on this?
I think, you know, I think by the time I went to school it would have been 71. And I know for a fact I used to go to school with black eyes and fat lips, and we'd have welts from the vacuum cleaner pipe and the wood, whatever Mum could get her hands on. But I just think it was normalised, because I can never, I don't remember anybody pulling Mum up for the violence she inflicted on us, me and my older brother in particular. And as a whānau, we were all beaten. All of my mother's brothers and sisters beat their kids. So there was nobody outside of our house that was going to stick up for us because they were all doing the same thing. And, you know, we actually had one auntie who we were all terrified of, whom our parents threatened us with. You know, so speaking out or going against the code of that you soon learn exists in whānau wasn't something that any of us as children ever thought of doing. And as far as the sexual abuse, I mean, I was quite... At school, I mean, most of my feelings, most of my stress, because of the way that I was treated, because of this, my father sexualising me really young, 15 months of age, you know, and where children aren't meant to deal with sexual feelings to that extent at all. Our bodies aren't, our brains aren't made up to deal with that. So all of my stress, it was located in my private parts. So you know, that's just how I coped with stress, was that. And so at school I would be doing all sorts of things, and instead of the teacher asking me or saying, are you okay? What's happened to you? Why you do these things? They'd put it, I remember a couple of times putting an announcement across the loudspeaker system which went into every single class. Would Chris Atkins' sister, that's my brother, would you stop doing this in the playground? I mean, there were so many signs that something was going horrifically wrong for me at home, but nobody did anything other than that. That's the only time I remember, and it was embarrassing, but I didn't know how to deal with with those emotions or feelings, or regulate anything that was happening in my life. So, you know, there were adults that actually could have stepped in at a lot of stages, but they didn't.
So the whole of society just turned a blind eye to this huge injustice that's happening in their community.
Yeah, I'd say yes, and also say that you know, now we're a lot, whether we enact or whether we activate ourselves to the injustices that are occurring, a lot of the time we don't know how to. So I know that in the 70s, nobody did anything. I mean, my mother used to run up the road in her undies with my father chasing her with an axe and a tomahawk, and he used to park across the road from us drunk and put his foot down flat on the pedal of his car and drive it through the fence and smash it into our house. You know, so even the neighbours, there was that, people didn't want to get involved. We were just that family. We were that family, and I was thinking everyone else was that family because we had kai, other than when my father was in prison, and my dad did a lot of jail for rape and child molestation, and So when he was in jail and it was just left to Mum to be the only breadwinner, there were times when we didn't have kai, and that's because the people that came to the parties would eat you out of house and home. But yeah, I think it was normalised. I mean, it was normal to me. I thought everybody slept under their bed. I thought, I thought everyone lived with that terror that I lived with, and every day, all day, every day, going to school was my safe space. But then going to school, you got whipped up anyway. And because I wasn't sleeping at home at night, there were days when I might nod off in class and you'd get strapped up, whopped up for that. So there was just that continuous physical or sexual or emotional abuse.
So you have been through some abuse that prisoners of war get dished out to them, and you're only 6 years old, and obviously you must have suffered from some post-traumatic stress syndrome, and now today in the 21st century you've got the courage to be able to talk to this. So what's helped you with, getting the courage to be able to speak to this, to help you recover?
I think it's been that an education journey, but there came a time in my life because I tautoko what you're saying with the post-traumatic stress, and the outcomes of so this is child maltreatment in its purest form, okay, and the outcomes of that, because we don't have our cultural our ways of healing. We don't have our ways of restoring the mana of an individual or a hapu, or when those transgressions, when they occur, my mother was abused. My mother was sexually abused. My mum was a mother at 13. So she never got to put herself back together either until she was old. And it's because we don't have the leadership and the models that actually tell us that, that we're seeds born of greatness. You trip through your life trying to fill in those empty spaces, because there's a lot of empty spaces when people have taken all of those things that, for me, they took away from me, and they were my whānau. It wasn't strangers. The odd stranger, the odd man my mum brought home from a night out, but they were my whānau that were hurting me. So my coping mechanisms became, I ran away from home really young, criminal behaviour really young. I connected up with a cousin who was already out there burgling, and if that's the word, burglaring, mm-hmm. And and I just became a watch. I used to watch out for her, and I soon got into came to the notice of the social welfare back then, and went through those systems, and then ended up in extremely violent relationships myself from the age of 13, and then trying to escape my own feelings of self-hatred through drugs and other substances. And so there's been a whole lot of things I've, tried to, the self-harm, I guess, I've harmed myself, and I think trying to replicate the harm that was shown me as a child. So I'll call it a lot of self-harming behaviours that have taken me to a lot of different places. And when I became a grandmother, I was given an ultimatum by my son, and that was to stop doing the things that I was doing, otherwise I wouldn't be a part of my mokopuna's lives. And that kind of gave me, I suppose it was a koha from him, but it helped me to realise that I was worth more than what I'd been shown, and actually more than what I was accepting, because I began to, I accepted less in the relationships that I was in, and I didn't know that I could be anything other than the person who I was at that time, which wasn't a very good person.
So that was a pivotal turning point. Your son puts an ultimatum on you, and then there's a moment there that you make a decision.
Absolutely, and for me, I say it's my tipuna right then decided that I'd learned enough, that I had learned enough, and that was the time where, for me, I was going to take all those learnings, and I was going to be able to turn those into something positive, and create change, not just for me and my whānau, but for other for other whānau, not just for me and my mokopuna, but for other mokopuna and mokopuna tuarua, because for me it's about the legacy. It's what I do now. It's not about creating change. My mokos are my driving force, but their mokopuna, what's it gonna be like in their time? What can I do to influence their lives? I may never meet them, but what I do today is going to have an influence on who they believe they are, where they fit in this world, and it definitely is not going to be shaped on anything, the upbringing I had, or even what my children saw. My children used to be sitting watching TV while I was being brutalised like my mum. My son, that same son that gave me an ultimatum, he'd stay home from school as an 11-year-old for a month because I wouldn't be able to walk for a month. And he'd be caring for me and my wounds. So that cycle, that how I was raised, I raised my children in the same life without the sexual abuse. But the violence was still there. And I took away from them their ability to find, whether they could, that control in their space of who they are. And and now I know how that impacts on us. I work really hard to do things differently for my moko. It's
generational, isn't it?
Yeah, and I didn't know that you could break. That was something you could change. I thought it was inherently, it just happened. With my kids, I used to hear the word cycle, and I knew what a cycle was, but I didn't know, that they were behaviours. That there's just a whole lot of behaviours that we've learnt to cope with, what's happened and what's happening. And sadly, what is going to happen. But we can jump off that bike if, we can jump off that, I guess, that journey with the right support and the knowledge that,
Do you think that there's an overriding, arching ideology or an event that happened in this area that's caused this cycle of generational abuse?
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly, I put this all down to colonisation. All of it. Our first encounter with Captain Cook, or in the beginning of colonisation, it ended with the deaths of so many of our tipuna. The legacy, their legacy, not only ended there for them, but the legacy that followed has been, it's unresolved trauma, and that inability to practice our own healing, our own ways of being and knowing our own, just to be Maori, it ended there, because we've just had an influx of colonial practices, people who say we should be thankful that we've even, if I say that smoothing of the pillow of the dying race for Maori, it's still alive today, the way that our counsellors, the bylaws that they create for us as Maori, we're second class or third class citizens, if that, because there's a whole lot of other people in the pecking order above us now. So yeah, for me, colonisation is, and it's still happening. It didn't occur 250 years ago and then disappear. We're still being colonised now. The colonial project is still happening. It's still alive and well today, and thriving. And I think we need to be aware. We need to be always aware that it is alive. Otherwise, we slip back into that space where we start blaming ourselves for everything that's going on around us, why we're not achieving, why we don't own homes, why our kids drop out of school, why we are still abusing each other. Because now Māori are abusing Māori, but we don't have, we don't have the same supports. We don't have, our families are broken down, and we don't know how to heal the mamae that exists within our whānau now, because there's a whole lot of generational pain that has come to me that I've passed on to my children. That's a whole lot of people's pain there. But how do we stop that from being handed down to our mokos when they've done nothing to deserve that? And the outside world, the colonising world, will tell us that, that's just who Māori are. That's just what they do. And that's not who we are. That's not the heart and soul of who we are. But that's this imposter, it's an imposter mask, a shield that we've actually been covered with, and we actually do pick it up ourselves because we don't know any other way. And that not knowing any other way is as simple as going through all of those experiences that I've gone through, and then my belief in me is that I'm just a really bad person, and that all of that abuse happened because I must have wanted it, which were the words of my mum. So then we turn all that, the way that people treat us, we turn it inwardly, and we believe it's about us as a people, as a culture, as a community, and it's not about us. That's just a behaviour that we've those are just the things the residue of trauma that we've learned and we believe are who we are, you know, and it's just the standing up and saying that, you know, no more, that's not who we are, that's not what I want for my mokos, that's not what I want for their mokos. You know, we've got to start standing up and being who we were meant to be. You know, I know those things happened to me, and they impacted on my life in a, you know, they had a huge negative impact on my life. But now I know I'm on a journey that I was always meant to be on, you know, without that mixed up mess in between who I am now and who I want to keep developing and into, you know, into being and becoming. It's about the destination now. It's the journey and not the destination. You know, that's who I want the world to know. That's who I want my moko to know. But I'm not. But I want them to know too. This is where I came from. This is what my life was, and this is why it's so important that we, as a community, as whānau Māori, we are the voices, and we're not ashamed or fearful of calling our neighbourhood out, or our community or our nation out on when what we're doing isn't okay. You know, I'm not going to be silent if they're fighting over there. I'm not scared to go over there and just knock on the door and say, "Are you okay?" You know, I'm not embarrassed about it. I'm not scared of it, because I know if I don't do that, the chances are there's a little girl in that house, a little Tricia, who may not get another chance in their life for somebody to put their hand up and say, you know, that child deserves better. Otherwise, they're going to end up living my life for 44 years. It took me to 44 good years, you know, that probably meant to be the best years of your life, but I'm now living those in my 50s. Yeah, we've all got to be that voice for those children that otherwise don't have the voice, and they won't have the chance to meet their potential until they're old. And then you've got a generation in between their children that are hurt and hurting. Yeah, we just got to do as much as we can in those spaces.
About a couple of months ago, Dr. Don Brash looked me in the eyes, and he said to me, "Colonization has been good for Maori, and around here at the Turanga Wars and colonization, there's been a lot of land confiscation, there's been warfare, there's been, you know, the Maori culture here has been under constant barrage of being exterminated by religion or just British authority altogether." Do you think that Dr. Brash is wrong? Colonization isn't this beautiful event that he thinks it's been for Māori. Do you think that it's the start of a cycle of trauma? The loss of land, real estate, being forced into poverty. Is this what's caused it?
Colonization took away my innocence. Colonization took away the tapu of my whare tangata. Colonization took away any hopes and dreams that my tipuna had for me. 250 years ago, a queer, and I don't know her name, but she would have stood on titirangi, or she would have stood on hikurangi, and she would have sung a ori ori for me, 250 years ago. And in that ori ori, she would never have imagined that I would have been abused by 50 different men before the age of 12. She would never have thought that her mokopuna would have to leave her body to be able to survive the sexual, the levels of abuse that that were bestowed upon me. She, colonisation not only took away my tupuna queer's hopes and dreams for me, they took away my mother's ability to fulfill those hopes and dreams. Till all that was left for me was the abuse, the trauma, being taken away from a Maori mother who was deemed to be incapable of being a mum, of being put in a family home where I was sexually abused, of being put in a youth prison where I was sexually abused, of being put into corrective training at the age of 16 where I was sexually abused. And in saying that, I wasn't the only one. Most of the girls were sexually abused. And then I went on, I was a mum at 15. I was being beaten every day, all day, from the age of 13 by my mongrel mob partner. Colonisation, if I'm meant to be thankful for all of that, then, I don't know what we're in amongst there. I should be thankful. But I am thankful for the gift of my children. And I am thankful for the gift of life because theoretically it's a miracle that I'm alive. And I put that down to the resilience to us as a culture, as a people. One of my mates, and I'm even going to say her name, Anne Wapu, she said, colonisation came along and it created this space for Maori where we're meant to thrive. And then the neoliberalism, it's come along and it's given us an even small space. And we survive despite colonisation and despite neoliberalism. We survive despite that, not because of that. So we've got nothing at all to thank colonisation or the colonial project and the racism and all the prejudices that have the white supremacy, all of those ideologies that have that exist because of colonisation. I've got nothing to be thankful to them for. I'm thankful for the mana, for the strength, for the aroha, for all of the principles that I never learned about when I was a child, that I do know about now. I'm thankful for that tipuna kuia that had hopes and dreams for me, 250 years ago. That's what I want to celebrate, is her. And in 250 years from now, I hope that my mokopuna, however many they are then, they know about their nanny, Tricia, that had hopes and dreams for them, but that I am actively doing whatever I can to make sure that those hopes and dreams come to fruition. That's what we need to be thankful for. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tricia. Really enjoyed the time we've spent together. Absolutely amazing testimony that you've got there. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Kia ora. No, thank you for coming into my whare and into our rohi and doing this for us. This is, thank you. Kia ora.
Kia ora.